Welcome to another Scottish Murders episode, the first of 2026. I'm your host Dawn, and this is part 2 of the Kay Wyllie and Nancy Nichol murder, specifically focusing on the murder trial. I know I didn't quite get this episode out by the end of 2025 as promised, but better a wee bit late than never. Also, I forgot to say in part 1 that this case was a listener request, so thank you to Alan McInnes for suggesting this case. So in part 1, we covered the tragic murders of 19-year-old Kay Wyllie in Ayrshire in 1984 and 18-year-old Nancy Nichol from Kilmarnock in 1985. We followed Kay's journey from South Africa to Scotland, her disappearance, and the heartbreaking aftermath for her family. We then learned of Nancy's disappearance and murder and discovered that Andrew Cameron from Troon was charged with her murder, standing trial in September 1985 for the murder of Nancy Nichol and Kay Wyllie. What we don't know yet, though, is how and when Andrew Cameron was linked to the murders of Kay and Nancy. All of this and much more all came out at the dramatic trial, which included a clash between a police chief and the defence counsel. But this will not be the last episode. There will be at least one more episode to come, as the verdict at the trial is not where the story ends. So let's get on with part 2. The trial began at the High Court in Ayr on the 2nd of September 1985, with 19-year-old Andrew Cameron from Troon being charged with having murdered 19-year-old Kay Wyllie by striking her on the head and compressing her neck with a ligature, and of assaulting and murdering 18-year-old Nancy Nichol by compressing her neck. Andrew denied both charges and lodged a special defensive alibi, claiming that at the time of Kay Wyllie's death, he had been driving at Troon, Mossblown and other places in Ayr, and at the time of Nancy Nichol's death, he had been at his home. Andrew Cameron also denied a further charge of breach of the peace at Harbour Road in Troon, where it was alleged that on the 2nd of May he had approached and followed a woman and put her in a state of fear and alarm. The 2nd of May was the same day that Nancy Nichol had gone missing, following her day and night out in Troon. Andrew Cameron did, however, admit to the final charge of stealing a quantity of petrol and a petrol cap from Kay Wyllie's white Mini car when it had been parked in Wellington Lane in Ayr on the 4th of July 1984, the day after Kay had last been seen alive. Don't worry, there's a whole story behind this charge, one that comes out at the trial. Kay Wyllie's mum and dad were first to take to the stand, with Isabel and Douglas Wyllie recounting the last day they'd seen their daughter, saying that there was a domestic disagreement, but that no harsh words were exchanged, and that while Kay and her dad had not spoken again after the disagreement, upon Kay returning to the home at tea time, he remembered that Kay had been joking with her aunt. Douglas Wyllie told the court that he and his wife had not liked the fact that Kay drove alone at night in Scotland, but when they had broached the subject with Kay, she had told them that this is Scotland, not Africa, with Douglas explaining that back in South Africa they had lived under a much stricter regime and had nothing to do with strangers and were rarely out after dark, with Kay's mum Isabel saying that in South Africa Kay had been so afraid of the dark that she would not put her hand out of the window to even close it after dark. Isabel Wyllie ended by saying that Kay was a bright girl, full of life. We never imagined this would be her last day. Kay's boyfriend, Russell Anderson, also took to the stand and gave a heartfelt testimony, saying that he and Kay had been dating for around 6 or 7 weeks before her death, and that they would go out together 4 or 5 nights each week. Speaking about the last time he had seen Kay, Russell said that they had spent the evening together at his family pub while he worked, before they went to his family home, and that Kay had left there around 1 a.m, and that had been the last time he had seen her alive. Upon being cross-examined by the defence counsel, Nicholas Fairbairn, Russell admitted that he and Kay had begun having sexual intercourse soon after they had met in June 1984, and that they tended to have sex in his BMW car. I'm not quite sure what this had to do with anything, but the defence counsel went on to ask if Kay had ever told him how she'd felt about him emotionally, to which Russell replied, "Not really." The defence then turned the questioning to how Kay's boyfriend, Russell, had initially been the police's number one suspect for Kay's murder, and that he had been questioned for several hours by detectives, before hastening to add that, "I am not suggesting you were in any way involved in Kay's murder." To which Russell replied that yes, he had been the police's number one suspect initially, and he had been questioned for hours by police, which he said he understood as, "Well, I was the last to see Kay," to which Nicholas Fairbairn quickly interjected, "Alive," to which Russell agreed, saying that I was her boyfriend. While day one was very emotional, with Kay's family taking to the stand and speaking about the last time they saw their daughter alive, day two revealed some of what had been going on behind the scenes in the investigation, when two teenage boys took to the stand to give their testimony. Okay, so you remember in part one that Kay Wyllie's white mini car had been found the day after she had disappeared, abandoned in a lane about 500 yards or metres from her parents' hotel, and it had been thought that the car had been abandoned there by Kay's killer. Well, the car had not sat there untouched before the police discovered it later the following day. Not only were there fingerprints found in it that couldn't reasonably be explained, but the car clock, the car keys, as well as Kay's handbag from the back seat were missing, with police indicating in newspapers that the fingerprints could potentially be of Kay's killer, and that the missing items from the car could also have been taken by her killer. It was certainly a line of inquiry police were investigating. That was until 10 weeks after Kay's murder, when police received an anonymous letter with Kay's white mini car keys enclosed, and it read, "Last week when I read about the murder of Kay Wyllie, I realised you'd got it all wrong. The murderer didn't take the clock. I did. I thought I had better put you in the picture that the clock is a red herring," going on to say that "I hope you catch the bastard," and ended by saying that if this anonymous person remembered anything else, he would contact them again. The anonymous letter writer was 16-year-old David Miller. David told the court that on the day he and his friend, 16-year-old Paul Brown, had stolen the items, they'd spent the day in Ayr just hanging around when they came across the unlocked and abandoned white Mini in Wellington Lane, with David confirming that they'd stolen the car keys, digital clock and Kay's handbag, before they then left the scene and thought no more about it. David said that while he had heard about Kay's murder, he did not connect it to the car they had stolen from. However, when he later saw a picture in the newspaper of the missing digital clock that police were appealing for information about, it dawned on him that Kay's murder and the white car they had stolen from were connected. And he said he panicked and tried to destroy the clock by bashing it off walls, before eventually putting it down a drain in the street outside his home. It wasn't until the following week when he saw another article in the newspaper, this time police mentioning the Mini's missing car keys, that David felt he had to do something and decided to write the anonymous letter to the police in Ayr. Following receiving the anonymous letter, police appealed again via newspapers for the anonymous letter writer to contact them, and David eventually gave himself and his friend Paul up to the police a month later, showing police where he had thrown the car clock, which was recovered. Both boys were cleared of having anything to do with Kay's murder. So that was quite an enlightening day for everyone. Lots of information to process, but there was a lot still to come. Taking to the stand the following day was a fingerprint expert and the pathologists who'd carried out Kay Wyllie and Nancy Nichol's postmortems. First, here's what the pathologists who carried out the postmortem on Kay Wyllie had to say. The court was told that Kay's body had been found naked from the waist down, with a ligature made from her bra round her throat and knotted at the back, but that death would have likely come quickly once her killer had placed the bra around her neck. It was also felt that it was very likely Kay had been alive when she had arrived at the farm where her body had been found, and that she had been strangled shortly afterwards. Pathologists said that there were marks on one side of Kay's upper body and on her arms, possibly from her being dragged over gravel, but that there were no signs that Kay had been able to put up a fight against her killer. Not much was said about Nancy's postmortem, only that she'd been killed by a compression of her neck, that possibly no ligature had been used to strangle Nancy, but that there was no evidence to determine that completely, going on to say that bruising had been found on the back of Nancy's neck, which could possibly have been caused by her killer's thumb, if he had assaulted her from behind. The court was also told that Nancy had bruising on the right side of her neck, but not on her left, with it being suggested that this could have been because her attacker was behind her and they were right-handed and had exerted greater force with their master right hand. Although when questioned further around this, the pathologists agreed that the bruising could also have been caused by a left-handed assailant having grabbed Nancy from the front. Next on the stand was Inspector Robert Scott of the fingerprint section of Strathclyde Police, and he said that upon Kay's car being examined, a fingerprint had been found on the inner surface of the driver's door window of Kay's white Mini, and that it matched one taken from Andrew Cameron, going on to say that the print had matched one taken from Andrew's left-hand ring finger on 16 points. According to gov.uk and the fingerprintinquiryscotland.org.uk, matching fingerprints on 16 points was generally considered a strong indicator of identity. However, since then, the 16-point standard has been moved away from, in favour of a more flexible approach to identification, as experts felt the 16-point standard minimum requirement could limit the ability to accurately identify individuals, with experts stating that they could be certain of their conclusions on fewer than 16 points. So the fact that the fingerprint found in Kay's car matched Andrew Cameron's on 16 points was pretty conclusive. Now this next bit was interesting, and something I had not found mentioned in any other articles I had read, and sadly I couldn't find anything else about this. So when Andrew Cameron's defence counsel, Nicholas Fairbairn, cross-examined the fingerprint inspector, he firstly asked him if he'd been asked to make any other fingerprint comparisons with the print lifted from the Mini between July 1984 and the date of his report, which was May 1985, to which Inspector Robert Scott replied that he had not. Before the inspector went on to say, "But if I say any more, certain facts may come out that would be detrimental to the accused." I'm guessing Nicholas Fairbairn stopped that line of questioning right there, as he wouldn't have wanted anything negative to come out about Andrew Cameron. However, Nicholas Fairbairn wasn't finished just yet, and had to try and get the last comment made by the inspector out of the jury's minds. And so he said that, wasn't it strange that it now appears this print lifted from the Mini is from the ring finger of the left hand, when apparently it had been suggested by a previous witness that the print found on the Mini window had been made by the right hand of someone sitting in the car's driving seat. Now again, there was nothing else mentioned about this or what the previous witness might have said, and I'm not sure how it helped Andrew Cameron either way. But it was an attempt, I assume, to put some doubts in the jury's mind about what the inspector was saying whilst on the stand. The following day, the judge, jury, defence and prosecution counsel and Andrew Cameron had a wee trip out of the courtroom and were taken to where Kay's Mini was being kept so they could study it and understand where the fingerprint was found, amongst other things. But the next day the drama continued back in the courtroom, when one of the detectives, who had been present when Andrew Cameron had been questioned after Nancy Nichol disappeared, took to the stand, and we finally find out just how Andrew Cameron had been linked to the murders of Kay Wyllie and Nancy Nichol. Andrew Cameron also took to the stand and gave his version of events, but I'll get to that soon. There is still quite a lot of information to tell you that will clear some things up, such as Andrew's explanation as to how his fingerprints were found inside Kay Wyllie's car. First though, Detective Sergeant James Brown read out the notes he had taken when Cameron had been questioned by two of his colleagues 6 days after Nancy Nichol disappeared. He began by saying that when Andrew Cameron was asked to account for his movements on the evening of the 2nd of May, the day Nancy disappeared, he gave contradictory accounts. In one statement, he had said that he had met Nancy by chance in Troon and they had got into a conversation, eventually having sex on a grass patch near a phone box. However, in another statement, he said he had met Nancy in Troon and had taken her home to cook a meal of toast and ravioli for them before they made love on the sofa, and then he walked Nancy back into Troon and left her there, alive. Detective Sergeant Brown then disclosed that these statements had been taken while Cameron and 2 other officers were sitting in a police car that was parked just in a side street in Troon, as you do. However, when they decided to move the questioning from this side street and actually took Andrew Cameron to be questioned at the police headquarters in Ayr, where a detective superintendent, John Fleming, led the interview, Andrew Cameron's story changed yet again. He apparently said that Andrew had told Detective Superintendent John Fleming, "There is something I want to tell you, but I want to see my mother first to see if I can trust you." However, the detectives had no intention of letting Andrew Cameron speak to his mother, and so apparently Andrew burst into tears before shouting curses at the detectives and continuing to demand to see his mum. Then apparently this behaviour stopped. Andrew Cameron instantly calmed down and then apparently told Detective Superintendent Fleming, "I want to tell you about these blanks I get. I just seem able to put things out of my mind and not think about them if I don't want to. I'm not sure what happened." Andrew then apparently went on to say, "I think I can trust you," despite him earlier saying that he wanted to see his mum and to see if he could trust the detectives. He apparently then went on to say, "Let me show you first where I took the other wee lass. She's in the water. It was just like the girl last year." Of course, Andrew was then asked by detectives what girl last year he was talking about, to which Andrew replied, "Her in the Minnie in Dunure. What's her name? Was it not Wyllie?" Cameron then apparently said, "Take me to Troon now and I'll do my best to show you. It was near the rocks." So Andrew Cameron wanted to take detectives to where he had dumped Nancy Nichol's body, going on to apparently say, "She's in the water. I think I can remember where I put her. It was that girl last year as well. It just happened. You know, I killed those girls." Detective Sergeant Brown also stated that Cameron had told detectives that he remembered waking up in the morning after he had met Nancy and found that his shoes were covered with sand and that his trousers were wet to the knees. Andrew Cameron had told detectives that, "Obviously something is wrong with me," and throughout being interviewed, he had on several occasions appeared to go into a trance-like state and would just stop talking. Next to take to the stand was Chief Superintendent John Fleming, the detective who had led the interviews of Andrew Cameron, upon him finally being brought to the police headquarters in Ayr, and upon being cross-examined at the trial by the defence, things became a bit heated. So the Chief Superintendent confirmed that whilst Andrew Cameron was being interviewed by himself at Ayr headquarters, he had volunteered to show officers where he had dumped Nancy Nichol's body, saying that on the evening of the 8th of May, Andrew Cameron had led them to the spot on Troon Shore where he informed detectives, "She's in there." Nancy's body was not found until the 1st of June, 3 weeks later. But when she was found, she was within 100 yards of the spot that Andrew Cameron had apparently pointed out to police 3 weeks earlier. Now, divers were brought in the following morning and a search of the area indicated by Andrew was carried out, but no body was found. However, when it was Nicholas Fairbairn, QC Defence Counsel's turn to question the Chief Superintendent, who was the then joint head of Strathclyde CID, he suggested that the story had been made up and that instead of Andrew leading police to the spot where Nancy's body was miraculously found 3 weeks later, despite not being found during a search, he suggested that police had in fact led Andrew to the spot and told him that Nancy's body must be in that spot somewhere, a claim that the Chief Superintendent vehemently rejected, saying it was absolute rubbish. Nicholas Fairbairn then put it to the Chief Superintendent that he must have thought all of his Christmases had come at once when Nancy Nichol's body was found 3 weeks later within 100 yards of the very spot where Andrew Cameron had apparently pointed out, with the Chief Superintendent saying that he didn't understand the reference. But Nicholas Fairbairn was not finished yet and tried one final time to rile the Chief Superintendent by asking him if it wouldn't have made sense for him to have been back on the beach early the next morning to personally point out the area Andrew Cameron had pointed to, so the police frogmen knew which area to search. Not to be outdone, Chief Superintendent Fleming told the Defence Counsel that he did exactly that, and he'd been on the beach at 8:15 the next day, indicating the exact area to be searched. The defence put it to him that, as the senior officer, shouldn't he have stayed at the beach while the search was being carried out? To which the Chief Superintendent replied, "I had a lot of other inquiries to make. I had far too much to do to stand and watch the divers all day," adding that he had delegated this job to a competent senior colleague. And just to make sure that point was hammered home, the Chief Superintendent was re-examined again by the prosecutor, who rejected the suggestion that such a senior officer as the Chief Superintendent would have risked making up such a story. He then provided the diving logs from the police sub-aqua team to show that the area pointed out by Andrew Cameron had been searched, with the chief superintendent saying that these areas would need to have been deliberately avoided by the frogmen for them to have missed the spot Andrew had pointed out, where Nancy's body was eventually found. Okay, so if I was a juror, at this point, after hearing about Andrew Cameron's alleged statements to the police, I'd be humming and hawing about whether I believed it in its entirety. However, the accused himself, Andrew Cameron, would soon be taken to the stand on what was the 11th day of the trial. We'll hear what he had to say in a minute, see if that makes things any clearer. But first, his mum, Marion Cameron, took to the stand, and here's what she had to say. Oh, before I forget, I just have to mention that a number of the articles I got from the Daily Record about this trial were sat right beside topless model pictures. Perhaps more thought could have gone into where these topless pictures were placed in newspapers. 2 people had been murdered, but I guess inappropriate advertising still happens nowadays, so what are you going to do? So there wasn't much reported about what Andrew Cameron's mum, Marion, said in the court, other than it had been pointed out to her repeatedly by the trial judge that lying under oath was a serious matter. Marion told the court that on the night Nancy Nichol had disappeared, her son had brought a girl home, but that she couldn't remember the girl's name, or in fact if her son had even mentioned her name. All she said her son had told her was that the girl had not been his girlfriend. Marion had actually been in bed when her son brought the girl home that night, so she wasn't able to identify who this girl was either. And she had been annoyed at her son, as he and the girl he had brought home had apparently been making a lot of noise, saying that she ticked her son off the following morning about waking her up with the noise. I do wonder what the judge felt Marion was lying about. I can't see how it would have damaged her son's case if she'd said that the girl he had brought home had been Nancy. I mean, he'd already apparently said that he brought her home in one of his many contradictory statements. And speaking of his contradictory statements, then it was 19-year-old Andrew Cameron's turn to take to the stand. Now first I need to clear up the importance of Kay's car clock and why it was such a breakthrough when the police received the anonymous letter saying that the killer hadn't stolen it at all. And that was because in one of Andrew Cameron's statements to the police, he said that the reason his fingerprint had been found inside Kay's car was because he had not only siphoned the petrol from it when he found it abandoned in Wellington Lane, but that he'd stolen money and the car clock. Now he told the police that he had done this about 3:30 a.m. on the night Kay Wyllie had disappeared, after he had seen a man leave it there and walk away. Now obviously when police received the anonymous letter, which eventually led them to the actual stolen car clock, which had been stolen by 2 teenage boys, it didn't look great for Andrew Cameron in their eyes. If he had lied about what he had stolen, and why lie about that in the first place, then what else was he lying about? And it didn't help that his statements to detectives kept changing. In court though, under cross-examination, he did admit that he had met Nancy the night she disappeared in Troon, that he had taken her back to his home and that they had had sex, before he then walked her back to Troon and left her there, alive. And upon being asked by his counsel if he had killed Nancy, Cameron apparently whispered, "No, sir." He also vehemently denied that he had directed detectives to a spot on Troon Shore where he had allegedly dumped Nancy's body in the sea. He did agree, however, that he had gone to Troon Shore with police, but that it was the detectives who had suggested doing that, and that whilst there, he had pointed out nothing to them, saying that the police witness who said that Andrew had pointed a spot out to police whilst at Troon Shore was incorrect. When Andrew Cameron was asked by the prosecution why he didn't come forward to help search for Nancy when she had been reported missing, he said because he didn't like the police. And then things started to change direction. It no longer was about Kay or Nancy being murdered, but about how Andrew Cameron had been treated. It all started when his defence counsel, Nicholas Fairbairn, asked Andrew why he had repeatedly changed his story to the police, to which Andrew replied, "Because of the treatment I was receiving." The trial judge, Lord Ross, then stepped in and asked Andrew, "What do you mean by that? What treatment were you meaning?" To which Andrew Cameron replied, "Every time I gave an answer, they said it was a lie and they punched me. It wasn't a pleasant experience." When he was asked if he remembered when he had been punched and slapped by the police, Andrew Cameron said that it was when he was being questioned in Ayr Police Headquarters on the 8th of May, and that his story had changed so much, as he was just telling the police what they wanted to hear. Andrew Cameron appeared to become upset at this point, and was seen to blink back tears before he added, I've done nothing. I'm innocent. The police just picked on the easiest person and it's not fair. However, the prosecution Solicitor General, Peter Fraser, wasn't buying it and began to cross-examine Andrew Cameron. He firstly asked him how many times he had been hit, to which Andrew replied, "I wasn't counting." The prosecution then asked him if he had told his then solicitor, Joseph Beltrami, that he had been struck by the police, to which Andrew replied that he hadn't, before going on to say, "I didn't say struck, I said I had been ill-treated." The prosecution, feeling that he had done his job in putting doubts in the jury's mind about this alleged ill-treatment claim, ended by suggesting, "Isn't it the case that the first time you have told anyone about being punched was here in the witness box this morning? Isn't this just one more of the lies you have been telling all along?" To which Andrew quietly replied, "No." And that was all that was reported about Andrew Cameron's time on the stand. Like I said, it stopped being about Kay and Nancy's murder and became more to do with how he had been treated. All that was left now was the summing up, before it was the job of the jury of 4 women and 11 men to decide on a verdict. But before that, just one final thing I didn't mention, as it wasn't presented at the trial and only came out later as it didn't go anywhere, but there had been a tiny piece of blue fibre found on Kay Wyllie's body that detectives hoped would lead back to Kay's killer, with Andrew Cameron being firmly in their sights. However, upon searching Andrew's home, they didn't find any clothing that could link him to this fibre. They did, however, discover, after speaking to Andrew's friends, that Andrew often wore a blue anorak, which on searching his home for a second time, they found. I wonder where the anorak was on the first search. Had Andrew hidden it, or had police just not thought it relevant? Anyway, despite police scientists confirming that the blue fibre found on Kay's body was similar in colour, texture and appearance to the fibres from the blue anorak, they just couldn't be 100% sure. So the fibre found on Kay's body could very well have been from Andrew's anorak, but sadly this piece of evidence was a dead end. Okay, the summing up. The Solicitor General, Peter Fraser, QC, urged the jury not to be swayed by public horror or prejudice, or revulsion that they may have felt over some of the evidence that they were presented with, but warned them to consider the evidence carefully and not to shy away from making a decision just because it might be difficult. He also advised the jury to remember that the accused, Andrew Cameron, had over 10 months to twist and tell lie after lie in order to save himself. The defence counsel, Nicholas Fairbairn, QC, told the jury in his address that the main evidence against Andrew Cameron had an impurity and taint about it, and they should reject it because of this. Going on to say that, in this country, confessions, true or false, dragged out of a person cannot be admitted in evidence. He has the right to silence. Nicholas Fairbairn then went on to read from a legal textbook, appearing to try to school the jury on the law, which apparently he should not have done, and it had annoyed Judge Lord Ross, who said in his address to the jury that Nicholas Fairbairn, the defence counsel, should not have done that. The law is for me to give. Lord Ross then went on to say to the jury that it was unfortunate that the allegations of ill treatment from Andrew Cameron about the police during his interviews were not put to the policemen while they had been giving evidence at the trial, so that they had a chance to reply or deny these serious allegations. He went on to ask the jury to consider why these allegations were not made sooner, as if they were true, then the statements made by Andrew Cameron to the police that had either been read out or played in court could have been untrue. He went on to advise the jury that if they felt the statements had been obtained fairly, then they could accept them, and that there then was sufficient evidence to convict Andrew Cameron of murdering Kay Wyllie. But if they felt the statements had been obtained under duress, then they must reject the statements given by Andrew Cameron, meaning that there was not enough evidence and that they could not convict. But that was for the jury to decide. Addresses having been made, the jury were asked to retire to deliberate and come back with their verdict. Now I'm going to leave it there for part 2, because like I said, the trial isn't the end of the story. And that story pretty much starts outside of the courtroom after the jury have returned with their verdict. So I'm going to pick back up there in part 3, which will be released in 2 weeks' time. I'll now not be taking a break in January as I thought, due to this case running over more episodes than I anticipated. So I'll be taking a break in February instead. So until then, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.